The smell of damp cardboard and sour paint clung to his hands so strongly that even water from the well could not wash it off before nightfall. Sheets of paper with blots embedded in the fibers lay on a bench at the city gate, as if they had dried right in the wind, and every passerby stumbled upon the same word: list. In the morning, it was seen at the tavern, in the afternoon at the gates of the market square, and in the evening on the doors of the bathhouse. The paper, familiar to every craftsman by its crunch and wire marks, suddenly became a weapon that did not cut, but left a mark, a long, sticky one, the kind that is carried by a family, a workshop, a brotherhood. On the eve of the city council elections, the letters openly pierced the lives of the townspeople. The names of neighbors, suspicions, hints, other people's beds, other people's debts, other people's illnesses, written out as if sacks of grain had been unloaded at the warehouse, and an inventory of losses had been compiled. Dear friends, this is the male voice of the channel, glad to welcome you. Right where you are watching us from, what your cities are like, what the squares in front of your town halls are like, what your markets are like in the morning. Leave a couple of lines in the comments. Whose lists do you have in your archives? Who took up the pen and paper, and when? Enjoy listening. Today, we'll talk about how the myth of purifying morality becomes a tool of pressure, and how paper with watermarks sometimes speaks louder than the cries in the square. In the northern trading commune under the emperor's rule, when the sovereign, who considered the stars no less important than reports, sat in the capital, spring followed the schedule of fairs and tax collectors' visits. The magistrate was preparing to renew the council. The guilds had already nominated candidates. The clergy had drafted remarks on propriety, and the guards, having received money from the treasury for street lamps, lamented that the lamps burned in the wind for no longer than the hour of prayer. At that moment, a carefully compiled list appeared in the city. It was not read aloud, but even those who assembled letters on Sundays under the supervision of the deacon recognized its rustle. The title promised to expose the decline in morals, and inside it listed the sins of adult townspeople with hints, circumlocutions, and references to beds and baths, widows' houses, and contracts concluded in the presence of a neighbor and a candle. Not a single word resembled court records or council resolutions. The only documentary evidence of the list was the confidence of its tone and the evasiveness of its wording. The myth in the city was persistent. Before the elections, purification was as necessary as a winter inventory, as if the statutes of the guilds or the decrees of the bishop required not only the courtyard to be swept clean, but also the memory of the neighbors. The document said the opposite. The ordinances, rewritten by the city clerk with seals and signatures, mentioned taxes, measures of bread, rules for selecting meat, and the obligation not to block drains, but not once did they mention permission to print blacklists without authorship. The habit of anonymous layouts came through pamphlets from the South, from fairs where printing tables worked at night. There they already knew that the morning paper was faster than rumors in reaching the cathedral steps.
craftsman, accustomed to handling leather and glue, saw in paper what the average person did not.
A bookbinder from this canal district kept pieces of defective notebooks and strips with false lines printed on them. These were useful when a customer asked for a lining to be inserted into the spine so that the stitching would not rub through the thread. He was the first to express a simple but decisive idea. Paper remembers where it was born. A watermark is not a decorative pattern, but the signature of the mill wheel, the name of the owner, and the degree of bleaching of the rags. In the town on the river, where there were 2 paper mills with drying rooms in the attics, the mark of one was known to everyone: a crown with a tulip, the other, a wheel and a cross. The sheet from the list bore neither a tulip nor a wheel, but a figured coat of arms, recently seen in prayer books, printed not here, but in the neighboring courtyard, where secular evenings and conversations about trade debts were held. The bookbinder placed the sheet on the glass, ran his finger over the shagreen surface, and saw lines as thin as the veins in his palm from the wire. The spacing between the strips did not match what was done in local frames. This was the first crack in the wall of certainty. If the paper was foreign, then the sheet had been brought in and printed somewhere nearby, where there was enough money to buy reams. Next, he decided on the font. There were books of all kinds in the city, from church collections to merchants' account books, and every typesetter knew the price of typefaces. Old letters with rounded tails and flattened A's were kept in the arsenal of those workshops that could not afford new matrices. The rich were accustomed to transitions to subtle stroke contrasts, for which they paid in silver. The bookbinder, sorting through the spines, remembered whose paper he had spread glue on, where the needles had been brought from, who had replaced the needles with new castings. In the margins of the infamous list, the lead paint scattered a familiar spark, a slight rustle from a letter, with one leg slightly higher than the others. Such things are known to those who have kept books for years. The words on the list contain the same errors, caused by the same poorly processed matrix, which he had already seen in a treatise on weights and measures for the city customs office. The treatise was printed by a private printing house in the backyard of a house that residents called the home of one of the candidates' brother-in-law. In the same place, in winter, fashionable advertisements about piety were printed, strung together with equally wide line spacing. The city office had its own registers of complaints and grievances, and they knew that slander was not a theological dispute, but an economic weapon. The penalties for it were recorded in the account books with entire lines of fines, which then went toward repairing the bridge over the canal, purchasing torches for the holiday, and hiring new guards so that they would not moonlight as cargo escorts. The reality of moral control was different from what the leaflets portrayed. Bathhouses were inspected for water purity and fees, not for customer lists. Widows' houses were visited not for publicity, but for auditing state grain and shelter places. In parishes, family compositions were recorded for taxes and duties, and beds were mentioned only in the context of marriage contracts and certain fines for public scandals. The myth that the city was cleansed of debauchery before elections was convenient for those who were not part of the system of statutes. Such a myth did not need to be accompanied by a seal. It contained a threat in itself. The sheets multiplied. They were carried by young men from the port, selling them for small change at dusk, found on bakers' benches, where the flour absorbed the fresh ink, placed on the window-sills of workshops, when the owner was distracted by counting orders. The list stubbornly hinted that those who supported a certain program to reduce gate fees and change the guild's participation in government were allegedly connected with houses of ill repute, with debts for beds, with doctors who wrote down in their notebooks what they themselves had invented. The names on it were not random. First, women from families of craftsmen and shopkeepers, then apprentices, and people without voting rights, then adult parishioners whose relatives served in another parish. It was a clear attempt to break the union of the two guilds and sow suspicion between neighborhoods where people were used to helping each other. No minors, no real court cases, only adults and hints that were easily taken by those who benefited from seeing their opponent not as a neighbor, but as a shadow. In the bookbinder's house, where the walls were saturated with glue and alum, those who were ready to bury themselves in paper, like a doctor in a wound, gathered. The clerk, accustomed to reducing texts to rubrics, took out of the drawer the originals of old early decrees on printing matters. They stated that without the master's signature and the workshop's mark, the sheet was considered an unfinished product and was subject to confiscation. A brother from the Guild of Scribes reminded everyone that watermarks in our city were registered in the council's books. The mill owner was obliged to present a sample of the cloth when changing the pattern. A doctor, a private one, not a city doctor, recounted that rumors about beds were more often born in the queue at the baths. Everyone was an adult, everyone understood the weight of their words, and no one needed to be overly frank. The bookbinder himself came to the city as a mature man after an apprenticeship in the land across the river, and was accustomed to relying not on rumors, but on the line of the seam, the thickness of the cardboard, and the smell of rosin. Their plan was simple. Don't argue with the myth in the square, but present a document. To do this, they needed to break the list down into characteristics. Paper was first. Font and typeface was second. Layout was third. There were no two identical typesetting tables in the city. The distance between the lines was determined by spacers, thin strips of lead that had long since become mixed with dust and grease from hands in every workshop. They reveal character. At his brother-in-law's house, the typesetter liked wide margins because customers had a habit of leaving pious notes in the margins. The margins on our list were the same as in his announcement about a charity fundraiser last fall. In addition, we noticed the rattling of the same letter in the same positions. The Latin S in the titles had a microscopic burr, which left a barely noticeable shadow in the same place on the line. This is not a scribe's mistake. It is a scar from the tools. Then there was the question of connections. The brother-in-law's printing house was officially registered as a place for printing liturgical texts and calendars. But the city knew that the calendar was just a front, and that the printing house received money from urgent orders for private announcements, advertisements for renting premises, and memoranda for the pious, which were distributed with the participation of city brotherhoods. On paper, the brotherhoods were independent, but everyone knew that the political life of the city was conducted in the kitchen. Who was courting whom? Who had entrusted the education of their son to whom? Who had sold their share in the salt warehouse to whom? The candidate's brother-in-law kept a house in the neighborhood where collections were made for widows on holidays. Europe was rolling toward war, then toward peace, but this house was holding on to government contracts. And here it coincided painfully and crudely. The same printing house produced prayer leaflets asking people to support morality before the elections, without naming names, but inserting phrases that coincided with those on the list. The language gave away the printing house, as did the font. The style of the headlines repeated the turns of phrase invented by the same typesetter. He liked to inflate words with beautifully written P and V letters and end lines with dashes, which were often missing in cheap typesets. Activists from the candidate's headquarters came out to the square where the statue of the city's patron stood and spoke about purification. It was a familiar ritual. Calls for morality on the eve of the vote sounded as ritualistic as bells ringing for the harvest festival. But the city was not an empty backdrop. The councilors had a book of fines where handwritten records from previous years showed how changes in demand for crafts altered the rhythm of punishments. When workshops sold canvases well, there were fewer accusations. When ships lay idle in the port because of ice, complaints grew, along with debts. Talk of morals was almost always talk of money and power. And when two men from the city office came to the bookbinder in the afternoon, they did not promise him thanks or rewards. They simply said, in summary, that the city needed proof, not another correct speech. That evening, the bookbinder laid out his materials on the table, sheets with watermarks, places crossed out in pencil with a torn letter, and a copy of the city ordinance, which stated that printing anonymous lists about citizens meant violating the peace of the guilds and parishes. While the councilors were figuring out how not to ruin the market mood, the headquarters kept shouting about morality. At the fair, people laughed and looked away. Some recognized a familiar surname on the list. Some considered it a matter for the courts, not the square. And some silently took the sheet in their pocket to settle their small accounts. And here, what is usually hidden behind the facade of stories about morality began to show. Doctors recounted how a report of suspicious behavior deprived a woman of her place in a craft guild at an almshouse. Craftsmen mentioned that a hint in the sheet about purulent sores cut off an adult apprentice's path to promotion. Bathhouse owners complained to the office that such cleansing lists spoiled their guest books. People were afraid to come and paid by the bucket, not at the cash register, and the city lost revenue. None of these details were picturesque. They were dry and harsh, like a line in an expense book. This texture was frightening. Not blood in the square, but the long cold of a lingering reputation that breaks the morning queues at the bakery and the dry handshakes between master and apprentice. The doctor's notebooks, bound with string and stained with wormwood decoction, showed the truth. Diseases lined up, not according to temperament, but according to water and cramped living conditions. Where workshops skimped on ventilation and locked the windows for the winter, adults caught colds equally, and no sins explained the cough. Bath attendants at guild meetings said in retelling that they were checked more often after such lists, not for dirt, but for confirmation of rumors. Even those who had just paid their dues to the brotherhood could come under suspicion. And when the bookbinder brought the smooth sheets to the clerk, they saw that the noise about morality did not match the city documents anywhere, neither in the fine column, nor in the peace treaty between families section, nor in the reports on bathhouse collection. The city lived by its statutes, not by sob-filled sheets of paper. But the sheets were dangerous because they lingered for a week, like pain in the shoulder after a bad night's sleep. They spread through houses where rags and bread bags were stored, and returned to the market in the form of sidelong glances and short-changed coins. The bookbinder did what every craftsman learns when his workshop teaches him to think with his hands. He came up with a demonstration. The water in the canal was clear enough to show watermarks in the sun, and in the office, lamps could be arranged so that the wire strips would catch the eye of even the uninitiated. They took 3 sheets, one from the city stationery, one from a well-known paper mill, and one from the list. The elders of several guilds came, 2 brothers from the brotherhood came, and a guard who had received complaints from the baths came. No one spoke loudly or cursed. Each was given a sheet, and each saw that the list watermark was not local, and the wire lines on it did not match the pitch and thickness of those familiar to the city. Then they brought books of announcements, printed by the same hands that had made last year's collection, to help the sailors. Where the line ended in the charity announcement, the curved line of the letter swayed in the same way as in the list. A coincidence in one place could be considered a coincidence, but a coincidence in 10 places was a repetition of the hand and the metal. No blood, no fighting, no humiliation was required. Only knowledge of the craft. The candidates' headquarters continued to call for lofty values, as if everything that was happening was part of a great fast. But there was a law in the city, known as the dry law, which did not fit into the rally speech. Slander was punishable by payment. The payment was not symbolic, but rather for the destruction of the world of crafts and parishes. In the Book of Fines for previous years, one could read how an influential tavern owner paid for a fake memorandum on morality because he actually wanted to ruin the bathhouse opposite, not clean up the docks. And here, myth and document collided again. Bright words about the spirit were spoken in the square, while in the office, They calculated how much the city had lost in fees for the week, how many apprentices had left for other cities because of shameful insinuations, how many widows were left without a share in the market. The story of morality became accounting, and that is what made it so frightening. Not a spectacular bonfire, but a subtle note in the margins that destroyed the biographies of adults who had the right to work and to choose. By evening, the bookbinder and the clerk had prepared a bundle of documents, samples of watermarks, copies of layouts where font defects coincided, and excerpts from ordinances. They did not write passionate speeches or compose pamphlets. They were going to present the city with something stronger than shouting, material evidence. Through this comparison, the private printing house and the candidate's brother-in-law's house slowly emerged from the shadows. The goal was not to destroy a person. It was to expose the mechanism, how the myth of purification before elections turns into an economic list for pressure, how control institutions, guilds, brotherhoods, parishes, are either drawn in or resist, and how all this is recorded not in rhetoric, but on paper, held in dry fingers. That is the anxiety of this story. The mechanisms seem boring, but they are the ones that break destinies, and words about morality become a screen behind which profits are calculated. It remained to be seen whether the city would withstand the comparison of myth with paper, or whether it would once again believe that someone's zealous concern for honor carried more weight than a watermark, the width of a field, and an entry in a penalty book. And while a white haze from the lime used by plasterers to patch the walls of the town hall hung over the canal, sheets rustled in the bookbinder's house, not as weapons, but as evidence, like the coolness of stone in a temple, the same in winter and summer, speaking not of morality, but of facts, for which people pay with silver and silence. By morning, the office already knew that the evidence could not be hidden back in the box, like a lump of rags. The streets smelled of warm pastries and slaked lime, and on the steps of the town hall were the footprints of the guards' boots, who had been chasing away the messenger boys with their baskets of cheap leaflets all night long. Watermarks, letter defects, line spacing, all this seemed trivial until the paper purchase and sale books were brought up to date. This had been the custom in the city since time immemorial. Every sack of rags, every batch of cloth, was recorded in a book, where the date, owner, intermediary, and destination were listed in columns. These books were not often shown in public, but in the office they were as well known as surgeons know the order of dressings. The bookbinder and the clerk asked to verify the origin of the foreign watermark, and the archivist, an elderly, thin man, brought a bundle with springy spines and old brown adhesive patches in the cracks. Inside was what is always found at the bottom of such stories: tapes of records for the year when the river rose higher than usual in the spring, and the mills sold paper at a reduced price, so as not to keep the raw materials in damp conditions. Among these records was a line about a batch of cloth with a rare coat of arms stamped on the other side of the frame, as if the master weaver had been in a hurry and turned the ribbon over. The same rare coat of arms shone like a draft in the pages of the list. Paper, like people, sometimes reveals its origins reluctantly, but in the light of a lamp, it becomes clear even to those who think with their eyes rather than their hands. The guilds love peace and quiet, because craftsmanship does not tolerate shouting. But when the cleansing sheets reached the bathhouse courtyards, the owners came to the magistrate with a complaint about losses and brought their book. According to the bathhouse charter, they kept a record of the names of adult visitors in order to collect fees fairly rather than by eye. Starting on the evening when the first batches of the list appeared at the gate, gaps began to appear in the records, as if a stone had fallen into water and ripples spread across all the containers at once. Adults stopped coming openly, began to ask the apprentices for water, paid not with coins but with goods, and some disappeared altogether because their neighbors' guesses proved more frightening than physical fatigue. And this was not a moral panorama, but pure economics. The city lost revenue. The baths lost payment discipline. And the brotherhoods lost their share from those who used discounts for sick leave. The magistrate had no right to discuss rumors. He had the right to count the shortfall. At this point, the myth crumbled. Under the slogans of morality, a decline began in the treasury books, and any sober foreman knew how it would end, with underfunded bridges, unpaid guards' rations, and unpurchased candles in the treasury warehouses. While some brought books, others brought memories. Near the canal lived porters, elderly men who unloaded salt in barrels in the summer and carried firewood and flax tow in the winter. They were rarely regarded as witnesses, but they saw the city in the hours when piety sleeps. They recounted that several nights before the leaflets appeared, carts with boxes tied with string were rolled up to the candidate's brother-in-law's house, light as if empty, but smelling of paint and sour glue. The back roads of printing houses always stretch through courtyards where laundry is dried during the day and scraps are taken out at night. If you open the lid of such a box, dust settles at the bottom, a mixture of lead, paper, and soot. It sticks to your hands, and in the morning it cannot be washed off. These men showed their palms, as one shows old injuries, and gray deposits were visible on the skin of their fingers, not from charcoal at all. They didn't need to say anything. They just brought the smell with them. The advisors understood that it was not a question of who was holier, but of who controlled the mechanism of printing and distribution. Because at the beginning of the 17th century, in the northern trading zone, when the sovereign in the capital was trying to pacify the princely markets, printing became as much a part of power as the collector at the gate or the weighing chamber. From what lay on the table in the office, a chain of evidence emerged. Paper from a batch with a rare coat of arms, a typeface with a characteristic defect, a layout with identical margins, boxes spotted at night, and the rhetoric of memoranda of piety which repeated the tempo and turns of phrase. The printing house of the candidate's brother-in-law was officially listed as respectable, but in fact it carried out urgent private orders that allowed it to circumvent the May and autumn restrictions on loud campaigning. And when the bill for the purchase of new letters, bought for silver under the guise of updating church sets, was brought to the case, it turned out that the payment did not come from the house's cash register, but through a neighboring trading office, where the brother-in-law held a share outside, without revealing his name. Anyone who has experience reading such connections knows that money does not like straight lines. It goes around corners so as not to make noise. Unexpected help came from a place where one would not normally look. A middle-aged woman, the widow of an apprentice, literate and neat, worked in a shop selling thread and cloth. Her husband had died of fever 2 winters ago, and she ran the shop so that the owner did not lose a penny. She kept duplicates of receipts for packaging materials, twine, paper tape, sealing wax. Her work was inconspicuous, but everyone who bought large quantities of packaging on the eve of major shipments marked these papers. She brought a bundle of records where, on several nights in a row, the same hand took twine and stamps for boxes, and in the purpose column there were code names that they used in the shop for printing houses. She did not know the intricacies of political games, and did not seek access to influential people. She simply presented an everyday trace that grows where people think no one is watching them. Thus, an unexpected benefactor entered the story, not a renowned lawyer or a wealthy merchant, but a person whose monotonous precision became the very cornerstone of the wall of evidence. The market institution, the shop with twine, proved stronger than the slogan of purity. Meanwhile, the candidates' headquarters raised their voices and continued their march for morality. Messengers distributed pious leaflets with prayer frames. City brotherhoods received letters mentioning their share in good deeds, and agitators in the alleys seemed to have agreed to repeat the same phrases about sweeping away sin. In normal years, this would have come to nothing, because the fair balances out the rhetoric. The warehouse is full, hunger is gone, people are thinking about selling, not about righteous deeds. But this season, the city was wounded. A late thaw ruined the grain reserves in 2 barns, a shipment of salt was delayed at the port, and a fever swept through the suburbs, keeping surgeons in the bathhouses for a week. When the sky threatens and the earth hurts, people willingly reach for simple lists of the guilty. That is why the list worked like a knife in the cold spring. It cut where things had previously held together. The clerk, who kept his cool better than any preacher, suggested acting as the statutes teach. If there is a public complaint, a documentary response is needed. He found a decree in the archives according to which, on the eve of elections, any printed sheet with a hint at citizens must be accompanied by the signature of the master and a brief note about the purpose of printing. This decree had appeared many years ago after a scandal involving fake pre-election prayers for peace, written in the courtyard of a dashing tavern owner who wanted to obtain a license for night trading. At that time, the city was involved in a long legal battle, and the magistrate decided to establish a rule. The printed word is not a walking stick. Its path must be visible from the letter to the bench. The new list had no master's signature, no certificate, and not even the sense to hide the repeated typesetting defects. This gave the right not to shout in the square, but to act through registers and fees. In order not to turn the process into a street brawl, the bookbinder and the clerk compiled a comparative folder. The list against prayer books, charity announcements against receipts from the bench with a rope, night cart routes against the column in the paper mill book. There was no need to catch the typesetter's apprentice red-handed. It was enough to compile a series of coincidences, which in the craft constitute the concept of one hand. The folder also contained a note from a medical brother who briefly described the consequences of the cleansing sheets for adult townspeople, lost jobs for women who had been removed from their places in the artels at the almshouses, broken deals for craftsmen whose names had been hinted at, bathhouses refusing to give discounts to those who ended up on the list for fear of inspections. There was no need for realism. It was enough to open the payment book and see the empty spaces, like moth holes in a woolen cloak. The second prepared crack ran along the line of the printing house owners. According to city law, property used for the publication of religious books was exempt from taxes. This was how religious printing was supported so that not every catechism had to be ordered from the capital. This privilege was tied to the purpose of use. If the machines were used for private anonymous lists, the privilege became a violation and was punishable not only by a fine, but also by the temporary sealing of the workshop. After examining the delivery books, the counselors found that on the night before the list appeared, the printing house had recorded overtime. The lamps had consumed more oil than usual, and the consumption of lead was higher than normal for salters. In accounting, fraud always eats away at itself in small ways. Someone's lamp oil doesn't add up. Someone's lead doesn't add up. Someone's box twine doesn't add up. These small things added up to a picture where the official pious goal diverged from actual production. The third crack ran along the line of the messengers. The city knew that a free sheet of paper would last longer if it was carried not at dawn, but in the evening shadows, when the cries of the market subsided and people chose their way home. Those who delivered the list used the same back alleys as the boys from the printing house. Each courtyard has its own passageway. Each workshop has its own routine at a certain time. A guard who had spent his whole life pacing the same alleys noted a strange synchronicity in his book. On the days when the lamps in his brother-in-law's backyard went out late, on the outskirts of the city, at the gates to the suburbs, at the same hour, boys passed by with baskets tied with ribbons from the very shop where the widow kept records. Counting carts and baskets is not a theological science. But when such coincidences stretch from night to night, even the most stubborn hat-wearer in headquarters must understand that the smell of rosin will not fade away. As the folder grew, the headquarters became covered with slogans. They tried to take the conversation from the plane of paper to the plane of threatening images. They told stories about shameful houses, emphasized unrighteous wealth, promised clean water in fountains, and strict order in family affairs. But the city was inhabited by adults, and their bodies knew a different reality. After the winter fever, their hands could no longer hold a needle. After rent arrears, it was difficult to sell canvases. After a hint in the newspaper, it was impossible to get a job in the administrative cooperative where salt consumption and expenditure were recorded. Fear did not sprout into a heroic pose. It hid in small refusals, in sharp glances at the bakery, in the shifting of a cap when meeting someone. And when the headquarters, having pumped up their speech, announced a march for morality, the city guard asked them to agree in advance on a route through the streets where the bathhouses and widows' houses were located, so as not to make noise near those who heal bodies and sew underwear. They remained silent and went as they wished. And this silence only emphasized that their morality was on paper, not in their feet. Towards evening, the bookbinder brought the clerk the last thread, a tiny scrap from the spine of last year's monastery book, which his brother-in-law's printing house had printed before the holiday. On the back, where the thread passed through the cardboard, there was a microscopic dent, a mark from a worn needle that had been used to sew the print run in a hurry. Exactly the same mark, in the same spot, appeared under pressure when the bookbinder bent the list and ran his fingernail along the fold. Such coincidences cannot be explained by prayers or chants. They can only be explained by the habit of the hand and the set of tools. This is what the documentary fabric of the case was woven from. On the one hand, there is the myth that morality purifies power. On the other, there is paper, type, twine, oil, lead, lamps, and the sweat on the fingers of the messengers. On the one hand, there were loud words. On the other, there were fine books, bathhouse regulations, printing house rules, and shop receipts, where the fragile world of adult city life was reflected more accurately than in speeches in the square. When this fabric became dense, the advisors realized that they could not delay any longer. And not in order to punish someone as a sacrificial symbol. The city does not devour its own for the sake of appearances, but in order to return power to the papers that quietly keep life in balance. Guild statutes, parish records, printing ordinances. In the evening they agreed on a public hearing to explain to everyone without hysteria how the mechanism works, how an anonymous printing house turns fear into a tool, how myths grow fat at the expense of others' losses. It was not a procession or a trial. It was what later generations would call an open meeting. Confirmation that the seam was strong enough to hold the heavy woven bag of facts. And when all these sheets were laid out on the table, flooded with the even light of the lamps, the city looked at itself, for the first time in a long time, not as a ceremony, but as an organism, where an incorrectly stretched thread can constrict blood flow, and a correctly placed patch
saves the page. By the morning appointed for public review, the weather had cleared, and the cold light fell so evenly on the stone slabs of the square in front of the town hall that the shadows from the steps looked like carefully laid seams. Traces of nighttime moisture still clung to the walls, and fingerprints remained on the doors where guards had moved the panels to let in the craft guild leaders and representatives of the brotherhoods. Inside, there was no smell of celebration, only the smell of lamp oil, oven lime, and wet paper, like when a bookbinder is brought stacks of damaged notebooks. The city did not put on a show, it put on an audit. Folders were laid out on the table, sheets with watermarks, copies of receipts from the rope shop, extracts from the paper mill's ledger, summary records from the bathhouses, guild statutes, and printing ordinances, where the ruled margins left room for notes and references. Every significant item in this story had documentary density. The paper did not just rustle, it bore the weight of decisions, and everyone who read it became a witness against the emptiness of slogans. As the clerk laid out the materials, it became clear how deep the roots were of what appeared in the square to be a sudden outburst of morality. In an ordinance from 20 years ago, there was a provision prohibiting anonymous leaflets with insinuations against citizens during the election of councilors, and next to it was an explanation. Official announcements must be accompanied by the signature of the master printer and a brief note about the purpose. The reference books of the printing houses contained licenses issued for religious texts, catechisms, calendars, as well as special permits for private announcements, with restrictions on content and an indication of the customer. The Book of Fines listed the amounts paid for fake memoranda of piety from previous years, which showed that those who fed the city with routine work suffered most from the purification. Bath attendants, spinners, porters, and widows in artels. The economy of the body, which was only discussed in semi-open conversations, was reflected in the figures: reduced contributions, missed shifts, unpaid debts to hospital brotherhoods. There was another layer that was rarely looked at. In the doctor's appointment book, which combined short notes on fevers and inflammations with notes on the patient's employment, there were gaps precisely during the weeks of cleansing. Where adults usually came after hard shifts, they stayed at home, endured, delayed their visit, because they were afraid to meet someone's gaze, afraid to hear whispers in the queue at the bathhouse, afraid of being recorded in the private services column. It sounded cold, not an outstanding catastrophe, but a long shift in behavior that weakened people, deprived them of normal care for their bodies, and turned not morality into action but fear into discipline. For a city with statutes, this was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous, because statutes do not tolerate arbitrary leaps. Statutes maintain the balance of carriages, bridges, boats, and stoves. When myth creeps into the statutes, the cords break at all levels. Representatives of all sides came to the meeting, except perhaps those who pushed carts with boxes at night.
The candidates' headquarters remained confident and tried to keep the conversation on the level of high concern. But the spacious hall did not tolerate airiness. The bookbinder calmly and steadily moved the sheets toward the light so that everyone could see the wire strips and the coats of arms of other frames. The clerk compiled a list of defects in the letters and margins on a single sheet. The guard who walked the night streets marked the routes of the messengers on the city map. The widow from the shop showed bundles of short receipts, which revealed how, 3 evenings before the outbreak of the list, one hand took the packaging materials for the printing house of the candidate's brother-in-law. She did not draw conclusions. She presented the cash register. Even those who found these details boring listened to how the little things coincided. In craftsmanship, it is the little things that become a chain. The city doctor added his dry line. He presented a brief summary. During the days of purges, scheduled visits by adults to the bathhouse before medical examinations decreased sharply. Requests for home visits without entries in the book increased, and refusals by employers to accept certificates from those whose names appeared in the hints multiplied. This led to longer illnesses, loss of earnings, unpaid debts to brotherhoods, and conflicts in artels, where every adult worker was needed. The harshness of the facts, as is often the case, was calm. No unnecessary descriptions of pain were needed. It was enough to list the consequences: a sick body without help, work without a place, debt without the possibility of repayment. Behind the word morality stood a specific body temperature and a specific pass to the pier. Guild statutes already defined the limits of interference in private life. Marriage contracts, fixed rights to property and shares, parish records, fixed the composition of the family for taxes, bathhouse books, fixed payments and benefits, and medical certificates, fixed working capacity. All these documents performed the function of control. But control was not equated with humiliation. Control was an accounting of stability, not an exercise in an exclusively moral stance. When someone tried to replace a document with a myth, the economic fabric was torn. In this sense, the urban system was not humane out of high philosophy. It was humane out of attachment to balance. Those who used the printing press for anonymous hints violated not feelings, but the schedule of bridges and bathhouse hours. On the 21st day of the 3rd month of spring, no one observed these things for beauty's sake. They observed them because otherwise they would have to repair what was broken at someone else's expense. Opponents still clung to the slogan of moral purity, but on their own side, something was happening that undermined their claims. The council had access to records of lamp oil, lead, and type foundry expenses at the brother-in-law's printing house, all as part of a city audit of subsidies for religious products. The peak in oil consumption, the increase in lead costs, and the publication of the list all coincided on the same day. There was no need to peek through the keyhole. It was enough to compare the lines. At the same time, money movements were uncovered through a neighboring trading office that issued invoices for letter renewal in circumvention of restrictions on private drafts.
Through the next door, the same people. Through the next, the same boxes. Through the next, sheets of paper with foreign coats of arms. Time and space were intertwined more tightly than they would have liked. Of all the twists and turns, the most unpleasant for the headquarters turned out to be not the font or the paper, but the people. Several senior members of the Artels, whose adult relatives were involved in the hints, brought peace treaties between families, concluded last year and certified on the city board. These treaties are part of the tradition of conflict resolution, compensation amounts, obligations to avoid public clashes, the order of joint affairs in the parish. The list of hints seemed to dismiss the existence of these agreements, creating the impression of eternal filth, even though the conflict had been closed according to the documents. This meant that the anonymous press was not just throwing stones, it was stealing the city's right to establish peace. For the statutory peace, this was a blow stronger than rhetoric. If people stopped believing in the board, the guards would become stronger, and the city would become harsher and poorer. The myth of the moral broom does not sweep away peace. It sweeps away trust in established ways of making peace. When the folder of coincidences became thick, the council turned the conversation into a procedure. The Book of Penalties for Slander listed 2 types of sanctions: monetary fines to the Treasury and the obligation to make a public retraction on the same board where decrees are posted. For printing houses operating in violation of their licenses, a measure of temporary sealing and inspection of equipment was added, with the possible confiscation of illegally acquired letters. There was a separate line of responsibility for campaign headquarters. If it was proven that they had used private printing for anonymous hints, the city had the right to deprive them of part of their public time and oblige them to move to open discussion of programs through debates determined in advance by the charter. This was not revenge. It was a return to the norm. Words to open debate, printing to signatures, morality to personal choice and agreement. The invisible coldness of history is that retribution almost never looks like a catastrophe. It looks like constant aching. At my brother-in-law's printing house, after the inspection, the lamps went out for the prescribed period. The type was hidden under lock and key, and the typesetters were sent home without work. This meant empty tables for some, empty bowls for others, and attempts by others to find temporary work with bookbinders and embossers. The candidate's headquarters received a paper about fines and the obligation to post a refutation, a text without loud words, listing what could not be documented and acknowledging the violation of printing rules. They were forced to accept the format of debates on the program: taxes on gates, distribution of fees in favor of bridges, bath schedules, conditions for benefits for widows. The rhetoric about the fallen was replaced by talk of the timing of repairs to the bridge over the canal and the salt content in hospital artels. This was harsh justice. The city was bringing people back to things that did not seem noble, but kept life going. But before announcing their decision, the councilors brought up one more thing:
something they were often reluctant to mention. Records of private agreements between adults, which set out rules, property shares, conditions of cohabitation, and responsibilities, were placed next to the list. These agreements, concluded in the presence of witnesses, were a vital part of urban culture. They protected not only women, but also men from arbitrariness, and provided support to all those who built their homes on the basis of writing rather than shouting. The anonymous list struck at the very heart of the city's most painful issues in a civilized manner. In a literal sense, it was a blow to the institutions of control, which lack ritual beauty, but have the power to remove knives from the table. Doctors could then write down the consequences in the margins. Bookbinders could mend torn books. Bath attendants could restore discipline in payments. But the incision made by the anonymous seal went deeper, into the habit of living by the letter rather than by shame. The guards reported their own part. In recent weeks, the number of nighttime skirmishes near bathhouses and widows' houses had increased. They carried not bodies, but fear. Men returned home, avoiding their usual routes, because they did not want to cross paths with those who might remember their names from the list. There was more humiliation in these detours than in all the slogans of the headquarters. Street violence in the city already stems from boredom, guilt, and hunger. The purge added shame and suspicion to these. When this was stated dryly and concisely, without amplifiers and with obvious statistics, the hall fell silent, and silence ceased to be the headquarters' weapon. It became the silence of craftsmen, who know that shouting interferes with the needle going through the seam. This was followed by a decision. The city declared the list to be a slanderous product of the private press, produced at the printing house of the candidate's brother-in-law, based on a combination of characteristics: paper from a foreign mill with an unregistered coat of arms, repeated letter defects, identical layout with characteristic margins, coincidence in material consumption and working time, delivery routes, receipts from a shop with a rope, and games with financing through a neighboring office. The printing house was temporarily sealed, and some of the letters were confiscated for inspection. The headquarters was fined and obliged to issue a public retraction. The city organized a series of open debates on the programs, to which representatives of guilds, medical and bath brotherhoods, widows' cooperatives, guards, and the treasury were admitted. The myth was countered not for aesthetic reasons, but for the sake of the health of the fabric. The city restored the institutions of control in their usual form, which constitute the invisible architecture where people grow up and grow old without unnecessary public slaps in the face. But this did not make history any brighter. The document does not instantly heal those who have suffered from insinuations. Adults who had been expelled from the cooperatives were left with uneven months. Women who had been closed out of piecework at almshouses were left with debts, and the brotherhoods had to redraft their aid lists. Doctors were left with unfinished courses of treatment, bath attendants with restoring order. The city did what it had to do. It brought the conversation back to the statutes.
It did not defeat sin. It defeated the private machine that printed fear. And this is a slow outcome, in which there are no heroes with raised banners, but adults returning to their places through the gloomy light of the afternoon. Fear will continue to creak on the stairs for a long time to come, but it no longer has the seal that was paid for with the lives of others. Deprived of the opportunity to spin purification like an eternal rope, the headquarters was forced to squeeze into the framework of the debate. There was no place for anonymity there. Places were divided by bridges and gates, bath schedules and hospital rations, grain reserves and guards at the suburbs. Rhetoric gave way to numbers written in full, and people had fewer reasons to carry their bodies through the shadowy streets. From this change of tone grew a feeling that later called itself justice. Not applause, not inspiration, but a heavy but steady rhythm of business. And when the bookbinder returned home in the evening, his hands smelled of the same rosin, but there was no smell of cheap night-printing ink in the air. He folded the folder with the copies and put it in the cupboard next to his tools. The history that the city had lived through was not over. It lay in a layer in those very invisible archives that later saved people from a new purge under a foreign seal. That same night, something very simple could be heard by the canal. Cartwheels creaking, someone carrying empty boxes of firewood, someone closing the shutters earlier than usual, someone washing the remains of glue from the doors. These insignificant movements make up the part of the chronicle that is rarely written down in words. But it is precisely these movements that show that the city understood. Morality, when printed without a signature, is just a technology, and that it, the city, still has ways to turn it off, returning places to their old functions, bathhouses to water and heat, parishes to records, guilds to rights and obligations, doctors to a notebook that can be erased the day before, where the column "Next Visit" again stands for a day, not fear. And just a few days after the decision, it became clear how slowly and stubbornly meaning returns to things that usually seem too prosaic for the chronicles. On the doors of the town hall, next to the notice boards announcing missing warehouse keys and guard changes, hung a dry refutation from headquarters, typed without embellishment or theological flourishes. The paper was thick, municipal, with the recognizable watermark of the mill on the river. The lines ran evenly, like an account in an account book. At the bottom were the signatures of those responsible for the seal and the magistrate's seal, which was used to confirm the exchange of plots for salt warehouses. The words, devoid of whispers and threats, seemed weaker than those in the square, but they were heavier. Every craftsman knew that a letter under seal did not argue, but worked. From this point on, the city was gradually rebuilt, not out of inspiration, but out of discipline. Where the purge had cut into the cash register, they began to sew. The bathhouse cooperatives drew up a new schedule, allocating morning hours for those who feared encounters at the door. And this was recorded in the book as a temporary measure,
not a sign of shame, but a way to recover fees. The Medical Brotherhood ordered that certificates be issued with names concealed, identifying adult patients only by their neighborhood and record number, so that employers would see the fact of the examination and not a reason for gossip. The treasurer noted in the expense book that these measures required more sealing wax and paper, but fewer skirmishes under the streetlights. In the warehouses, the sale of large quantities of twine and packing tape was subject to additional recording. Who was taking it, for what purpose, from whose doorstep, not as a punishment, but as a new seam, to prevent it from spreading next time. These boring lines were a chronicle of healing, and they were frightening in their invisibility. No one prayed to them, but they were the ones that healed. At the same time, the damage was being assessed, slowly, like autumn water. The magistrate demanded reports from the workshops. Who had lost deals? Who had dropped out of the artels? How the hints about the distribution of shifts had affected them. The lists, which usually featured bundles of canvas and barrels of alum, were now accompanied by short notes about adults who had lost their jobs for a week or two, about shortfalls in bathhouse fees, about delays in bridge construction. Instead of the usual baskets of bread, the carts now often carried empty boxes. They were returned from the shops because large batches of packaging had become rare. Porters confirmed in their accounts that a week after the list was published, there was less work than usual, and that some teams carried barrels around the central streets to avoid being seen. This was a side of fear that is rarely noticed. It does not shout, it changes the route of the cart. Meanwhile, the headquarters, forced to act not with images but with points, brought to the debate a program where the headlines did not allow hiding behind cleanliness. The debates took place in a hall that had previously seen the distribution of salt and discussions of pier repairs. 4 topics were laid on the table: gates and fees, bridges and decks, water and baths, widows' shares, and piecework in artels. There were documents on each topic: copies of old council decisions, statutes, treasurer's reports, notes from the medical brother, bath schedules. This paper was the main party. The candidate, accustomed to relying on purification, now had to figure out where to get the missing funds and how to allocate the repairs. A minor, almost invisible defect in the anonymous letters turned into a gaping hole in his argument. Questions about water required not reminders about proper living, but a plan for cleaning the drainage ditches and a method of paying for shovels for the diggers. The question about widows' shares did not require a reminder about modesty, but a list of units of fabric that the city was willing to pay for in the artels, and a procedure for issuing work without humiliation. There was no beauty in this, but there was a power that could not be avoided. On the 3rd day after the debates, the printing house resumed work partially. Only previously ordered liturgical sheets were allowed to be printed, with strict accounting for lamp oil and lead. It seemed like a simple measure, but in fact it meant control over time and resources. By counting the oil, it was possible to see who was trying to leave again at night.
The typesetters were assigned by the hour. Any urgent orders had to be accompanied by a note in the book indicating the customer. Deprived of anonymity, the press lost its power over fear and returned to its difficult but righteous task of preserving the text. For the brother-in-law, this was not a showy punishment, but a lever that had been removed. Without the anonymity of night, the machine lost the very insubstantial speed that makes slander cheaper than the ringing of a bell. However, the world is not made up of good luck alone. There were many people in the city for whom the list became a way to quietly settle old scores. They did not write letters or make a fuss. They simply stopped saying hello, changing places in line, or giving advances. It wasn't obvious, but doctors recorded more cases of insomnia in their notes, and bath attendants noticed more silent people who sat by the water longer than usual, as if waiting for the water to wash away other people's thoughts. The bookbinder said in his retelling that such tales of stories last longer than any debate. He knew this from books. Even if the spine is reinforced, old creases remain on the pages, and the reader, not seeing them with their eyes, feels them with their fingers. Therefore, using his authority as a master, he proposed that the guild, together with the treasury, introduce a small thing, a free lining in the spine for any books where peace agreements are kept. It cost the city a few silver coins and an extra hour of the master's work, but it meant a lot. Peace is better sealed when the paper doesn't break at the first turn. Neighboring cities heard about this story through merchants and letters with news. One letter came from the inspector of printing, appointed by the local council. He was in no hurry. He demanded not testimony, but books. When he arrived, he did not look for the guilty among the crowd. He requested a register of printing houses, licenses, manufacturing statutes, records of lead purchases, and typeface patents. His presence acted like cold water on a heated stone. It became clear that if the city did not uphold the rule, it would be held accountable for it. The inspector noted that privileges for religious sets could not be used for private political leaflets, even if they spoke of the good life, and that printing without a signature was in any case considered a violation of the commercial peace. Few people like such words, but they make cities similar to each other, where it matters. In rules, not slogans. The widow, from the rope shop, became another quiet center of change. Her neat slips of paper with numbers written in full were now attached to every large order as a mandatory appendix to the printing book. It seemed humiliating to those who were used to whispering orders, but it became the norm for the city. People stopped giving the widow extra looks when she entered the meeting room. Her notes were perceived as part of the accounting, and that meant respect in the adult world. She did not become rich. She did not become famous. But her handwriting turned out to be more important than the voices of others. This was one of the turning points. In addition to discovering the family ties between the printing house and the headquarters, in addition to the font and paper, a third link was found in the city: the precise hand of an inconspicuous worker, without which the mechanism of proof would not have come together. The unexpected benefactor did not carry the truth in his hands. He brought the check tape. Meanwhile, the candidate's headquarters continued to search for a comfortable position. They issued a statement in which they claimed to care about the city and want to restore trust. But it did not include the names of the craftsmen who were ready to sign it, nor did it contain any verifiable promises about water and bridges. Those who always replaced the weight of paper with the lightness of words remained on their side. But now even they found it difficult to turn the wheel as usual. Where the printing house's night lamps had stood, there were oil stains on the floor, and the guard said that in the evenings no one brought baskets with empty boxes anymore. Without this shadow, any lofty speech looked like a folding screen in front of a workshop, easy to put up, but unable to hold its weight. The medical fraternity tried to record the consequences, not for morale, but for the bodies. The report for the month after the list contained lines showing that adult patients had returned to their usual rhythm, but with some exceptions. Someone missed an examination, someone canceled a bath day, some took on extra work for a week to cover their debts, and as a result, became even more ill. This spoke to a simple truth. Slander and insinuations do not leave scars on the square. They leave them in the shovel and temple. Eliminating the machine source does not undo the damage already done, and the city must take this into account when distributing aid. The treasurer agreed to allocate additional fabric to widows' cooperatives for those who had lost their jobs due to insinuations, and obliged workshops to record the reasons for absences without assessments, only the facts. Thus the myth was translated into paper, and paper into rations, and rations into survival. The bookbinder worked more than usual these days. People brought him worn-out registers, peace treaties, parish records, ruined by moisture. He patched their spines, glued the places where the thread had worn out from the book, being torn apart too often by strangers' hands. He did not consider it a feat. It was his job. But now each spine held the memory of how an anonymous seal had tried to replace all these seams with an empty cry. Sometimes in the evening he would linger by the window and hear boats being pulled along the canal, cartwheels creaking, a cold throat coughing in the dark, not daring to knock on the doctor's door. These sounds did not belong in the chronicle, but they explained why the city had chosen paper over cleansing speech. Words about religion and order still swirled above the squares, but they no longer had a simple refuge. Parish records continued to record the composition of adult families for taxes, marriage contracts, shares and obligations, bathhouse books, privileges, medical notebooks, examinations. In one parish, the headman suggested adding a short column to the retelling of private agreements to indicate whether the couple had a written agreement on the rules of life and division of property, and if so, to note that it was certified by the office. This was not an intrusion into privacy. It was a recognition that writing protects better than hearsay. One thing would be noisy, another would be practical.
The city chose the practical, paper, ink, glue, rosin, oil, lead, water, a shovel, and cloth. And this decision was not touching. It smelled of sweat and the ability to keep things running smoothly. Public space also changed almost imperceptibly. In the market, between the bread and fish stalls, small tables appeared with clean sheets of paper and pens, where craft elders helped write complaints and statements. Not out of compassion, but out of an understanding that this is where the right decisions begin. Young workers who had grown up were taught to write numbers in full and to use ordinances as a tool rather than a threat. These small changes reflected the difficult lessons of the past week. The city understood that if the press had become a lever of fear, it needed to be returned to its position as a fastener. And while the elders taught the younger ones, a list of mandatory marks hung on the doors of the printing house: customer, purpose, quantity, time, without which the machine remained a silent piece of wood and iron. At the end of the month, the printing inspector left, taking with him copies of the city statutes and a promise to report to the Zemstvo Council that balance had been restored here without any show trials. The business trip took less time than any rumor. He left, and the city was left with what brings peace to people, with bridges scheduled for repair during the warm weeks, with bathhouses where schedules were restored, and inspectors were forbidden to look for unconfirmed rumors, with cooperatives where widows' lists no longer emptied in a single day because of morning whispers, with doctors who once again made notes, not on doors, but in notebooks. And although the shadow of anonymous printing still lingered on people's faces for a long time, somewhere deep down, something else was growing stronger. The confidence that myth cannot defeat a document, where that document is supported by water, wood, cloth, and labor. The candidate's brother-in-law also had days when he had to live without the romanticism of nighttime typesetting. He walked around the house with quiet sorrow, looking at the machines, touching the shelves with letters, like a man who had lost his favorite toy, but not his job. He had to sit down at the table with the treasurer and answer questions where there was no room for imagery. How much oil? How much lead? How many sheets? He was shown an entry in the expense account where a public subsidy for liturgical sets covered private anonymous printing. He did not argue aloud because there was nothing to argue about. The work was returned, but with seams so tight that the old thread could no longer be pulled through. And the bookbinder, returning one evening along the embankment, noticed a boy carrying a book under his arm with a straw braid on the spine, a school notebook in which the points of the charter on printing, fines for slander, and the procedure for requests to the office were copied. The child was already an adult by city labor standards, and he was taught not words, but procedures. It looked boring, but there was a quiet power in it. Tomorrow, he would be the one to hold the lamp up to the sheet and see the watermark before believing the headline. Thus, the ability to recognize paper became part of general literacy, not out of a love of books, but out of fear of surrendering the city to anonymous ink
once again. On the banks of the canal, the water carried thin strands of straw downstream, washing away the traces of spring transport. By early evening, the lamps in the houses were extinguished, and the empty courtyards, where carts had recently passed, echoed with the sound of silent wheels. At this time, stories usually fade away, but this one did not disappear completely. It remained in accepted debates and in bathhouse schedules, in new marks on benches, and in the careful hands of widows who repaired the backs of benches at the entrances to the artels. The city responded to fear as craftsmen respond, not with oaths, but with the joining of seams. And in this slow, stubborn work lay the main truth. Myths are omnivorous and fast, while documents are slow and enduring. When they stand side by side, it becomes clear which of them protects the body and which uses it as an excuse. And yet there was still one unfinished movement, the one that had been building up for a long time on the outskirts, in neighborhoods where the morning air smelled of manure and wet flax. There, the list affected not only names, it affected the habit of sticking together in courtyards, mutual assistance among those who did not approach the tables. It was there in the suburbs, courtyard after courtyard, that small gatherings were held to decide how to live if the paper went out again at night. At these meetings, proposals were made for guard patrols to the printing houses, for mutual guarantees for adult women hired by the artels, for keeping one person in each neighborhood who knew how to file complaints in the correct form. These proposals were not elegant, but they were lively. They grew from below, like grass between slabs, and it was they who promised the city that the new wave of anonymity would be met not with cries, but with a network of hands holding the paper so that it would no longer be torn apart by someone else's intentions. On the outskirts, the decision to have guards patrol quickly became a habit, just as it had once become a habit to lock carts at night with the same rope. The men from the streets near the suburban gates divided up the evenings so as not to overlap with the workers' shifts, and took on the tasks that were usually given to the guards, escorting adult women on their way to the artels, noting where the nighttime bustle was starting again, where baskets of paper scraps were appearing, where the lamps were burning longer than allowed. This was not military discipline. It was courtyard accounting, stretched across the entire neighborhood. The widows in the artels agreed among themselves and offered a simple letter of guarantee, one signed for the other, so that piecework would not disappear because of someone else's insinuations. The medical brother developed a procedure as short as a thin needle. For those who were afraid of baths, a separate hour was appointed and recorded not as a shame, but as a schedule of care. The bath attendants, tired of inspections, accepted this as silently as they accepted a new batch of firewood. Extra warmth is better than cold justice. These mosaic practices created the fabric of the city. At that time, program points were being discussed in the square, and on the outskirts, knots were being tied, thanks to which the points ceased to be words. The magistrate, seeing how the lower order strengthened the upper one, decided to consolidate several moves. The first was a register of seals, with samples of watermarks and wire steps. Paper mills were required to submit standards, and printing houses were required to keep copies of them in the office. The second was a book of castings and typefaces. Every time the matrices were updated, the type foundries sent impressions to the office with notes about defects that could appear when working in a hurry. The third was the packaging journal. Large batches of twine, sealing wax, and boxes were now accompanied by a short note about their purpose and deadlines, not as a suspicion, but as insurance against the repetition of anonymity.
It seemed that the city was sinking deeper into paper than before, but it was precisely this depth that saved it from foreign influence. The printing inspector, leaving the city, left on the table a few terse lines about the correctness of the measures chosen and their compliance with local regulations. An unsigned print is not a word, but a malfunction of the mechanism, and it should be eliminated not with thunder, but with verification. The day of voting arrived, devoid of solemn speeches, but filled with the smell of fresh bread and wet wood. Collectors stood at the gates, counting those who came not with their eyes, but with lists. In the voting hall lay clean sheets of paper, on which adults made marks, leaving no room for foreign inscriptions. The candidates' headquarters, having lost the lamp power of night leaflets, brought neat paper plans: how much money to put into bridges, how many hours to add to baths, how to restore widows' shares. His opponents brought their own, and for the first time in many years, the conversation about city order sounded like a discussion about roof repairs rather than a sermon. The bookbinder, coming in to vote at his appointed hour, saw a list of new statutory marks on the wall at the entrance, changes in printing regulations, packaging rules, amendments to bathhouse procedures, and realized that for the first time in a long time, the city was discussing itself without outside threats. He put down the sheet and went out to the canal, where, in the shade of the bridges, he listened to the water carrying thin straw downstream, as if washing away the past spring. The calculations took a little longer than promised, because each sheet was checked as rigorously as bookbinders check glue before binding. The result was not stunning, but practical. Those who proposed schedules and estimates, rather than the fears of others, were elected to the council. Among them were no people with glittering biographies, but there were those who returned fees to bathhouse cooperatives, scheduled visits to doctors, and regularity to widow lists. The candidates' headquarters took their seats not in the upper row, but among the ordinary ones, and this meant not defeat or disgrace, but a return to size. The loud mechanism became part of the common machine. The meeting room was once again filled with the things for which benches and long tables were invented: work schedules, vouchers for the release of funds, estimates for lamp oil and stone for bridges. Paper, having regained its density, ceased to be a threat and became what it should be in a peaceful city: a carrier of business.
The candidate's brother-in-law's family now lived in the even light of early darkness. The printing house, having survived the seal, breathed without strain, like a craftsman after an illness. The brother-in-law thought several times about selling his share, even meeting with merchants who laid out plans for prayer books, catechisms, and commercial advertisements. But he stayed in the business and became surprisingly diligent. He signed every sheet, not deviating from his new habit of placing oil and lead registers on the table. He looked at the impressions of the typefaces as one would look at the drawings of an unusual boat that had to navigate a shallow rapids. He did not become better. He became more transparent. That was enough for printing to cease to be a lever and become a craft again. Shortly before the summer fair, a thick folder was brought to the office, a summary of the consequences of the list across all strata. There were no big words in it. There were lists of adults who had managed to return to their places, and those who had slowed down. There were notes about fines paid by the headquarters. There were lists of materials used for new procedures. There was a summary from the medical brother about the restoration of the rhythm of scheduled examinations and about sudden dropouts when fear still reared its head. The treasurer signed a dry summary at the bottom. The city had incurred costs, but avoided a long decline in trust. He returned the document to its place and fixed the rules where they had previously floated in unfamiliar vocabulary. The bookbinder later took this folder to his desk to repair the cracked cover and reinforce the spine. He did it slowly, because rushing is harmful in such matters. While the glue was drying, he remembered how the first batch of sheets smelled of cheap paint, and the current one of paste and rags from which honest paper is born. The widow from the rope shop continued to be the invisible nerve center of the city. Her neat receipts were now automatically attached to the printing books. Her tickets were found in trade dispute cases, where it was determined why one batch of packaging went to the warehouse later than another. She did not seek recognition. She sought order that saved energy. Her hand unexpectedly tied another knot. It was she who noted that by summer, nighttime orders for boxes had decreased in the city, while daytime orders had increased. That where carts used to go at sunset, now wagons arrived at noon. That the ratio of oil to lead in printing paper had become more even, like the pulse of a person who had stopped living in fear. These statistics were devoid of drama, but they reinforced conclusions better than any slogan posted on a wall. The old bathhouse cooperative, the very one that lost its fees during the days of purification, added another line to its charter books. In the event of a recurrence of anonymous distribution, the cooperative shall automatically apply to the office and the medical brotherhood for a continuous clean water regime, paid for from the city's Emergency Sanitary Measures Fund. It was a purely technical clause, no more impressive than a boiler cleaning schedule. But the city took it as a necessary spring, holding the heavy lid from falling spontaneously. Even those who laughed at the bathhouse attendant's caution understood that this was more about caring for people than grand words about modesty and repentance. The clerk, in turn, managed to have a short paragraph added to the ordinances, which would later be quoted in textbooks for writing schools. Any printed word about citizens during the election period must be accompanied by the name of the master, the place of printing, the number of the sheet from the printing book, and the intended purpose. Every shop selling packaging must mark large orders with the date and quarter. Every paper mill must submit samples of watermarks once a season. There was nothing lofty about this paragraph, but it eliminated vulnerabilities. In the margins, the clerk made his usual neat mark, a thin line of ink indicating the place where the document and the myth had once switched places. This quiet mark was not intended for the public. It was intended for those who would leaf through the codex years later, experiencing a new wave of purges. Summer brought fairground tents, the inevitable noise, the smells of fried fish, resin, and cheap wine. Work picked up again on the outskirts, and the dock workers came to life, like a loom coming to life after a long pause. But against the backdrop of this familiar bustle, one shift was noticeable. The nightly leaflets with hints were not being passed around at the fair. Not because everyone suddenly took a liking to virtue, but because paper ceased to trust itself at night. Printers feared losing their presses, shops feared losing their privilege of quickly releasing boxes on credit, and mills feared losing their seasonal drying allowance. The economy of the body, which is usually whispered about, entered into an alliance with the economy of paper, which is usually missed. This alliance proved stronger than any cry for purity, and it was this that made the city more mature and calm. Along with this, there were personal events, invisible to the chronicles. Several women, whose names were hinted at in the list, returned to the widows' cooperatives, and, after a month, regained the right to their usual jobs. Several men who had missed their examinations returned to the doctor and made appointments for the fall in advance, so as not to repeat the mistakes of fear. Several craftsmen who had lost their piecework during those weeks paid off old debts and set aside small change for contingencies. These small traces of decision-making are not heroism, but maturity. They are the answer to history, because they do not seek beauty. They seek support. A city where adults, having survived fear, decide in favor of procedures rather than shouting, does not become lighter before our eyes. It becomes heavier in weight. And this weight holds bridges better than slogans. This summer, for the first time in many years, the bookbinder accepted a large order from the town hall to bind a collection of statutes and codes containing all the amendments made after the list incident. He worked on it slowly, like a man who knows the value not only of glue, but also of words. He inserted thin fabric ribbons into each volume so that the counselors would not lose their place on the pages, and reinforced the spines with split leather so that the books would withstand decades of opening and closing. The smell of rosin and glue again became the one that lingered on his hands until dark, but now it did not remind him of sticky night paint.
It reminded him of the strength of the seam. When he took the finished volumes to the office, the clerk placed them on the long table, where the folder with the evidence had once lain, and quietly noted the date on a piece of paper, not for the sake of celebration, but for future verification. By autumn, the first rains had come, and the stone in the square shone again, as if it had been polished for a holiday. The list of mandatory marks still hung on the door of the printing house, and sometimes young apprentices would approach it, read it, and leave, memorizing not the words, but the idea itself. Printing must be responsible. The widow from the shop, returning in the evening past the canal, saw that the men from the suburbs were still making their rounds, albeit less frequently. Fear was slowly fading away. The medical brother noted in his report for the season that the schedules of visits had evened out, and that there had been a decrease in untimely refusals of bath procedures. The treasurer was pleased that the article on emergency water had remained untouched. These dry lines made up the final part of the movement after the storm. Not a flash of victory, but a return to business as usual. And yet, in this story, there remained an invisible gratitude to those who hold paper when it can become a weapon. The bookbinder, for recognizing font and water. The clerk, for thinking in terms of registers and fields. The widow, for counting twine as carefully as someone counts prayers. The bath attendant, for opening the water to those who are afraid. The doctor, for recording illness where others prefer to attribute it to temperament. The guard, for counting steps while others count words. They did not defeat evil. They restored order to what the city is made of. And when next spring brings new rumors, the city will have not only the memory of fear, but also the formed habit of maintaining the document. The myth will knock on the door, but the door is held on hinges lubricated with oil from the same lamps that illuminated the watermark. Fear will always have a chance, but maturity has a tool. This is the emotionally clear outcome, not cruelty towards enemies, but a slow, mature decision to live by the papers and seams that do not hold themselves together, but hold us together if we hold them together.